These are notes on energy production and biosynthesis in plants to help you understand the plant data that we collected in class. So just kind of a recap of the data. In the light, we saw the oxygen levels increase and the carbon dioxide levels decrease, which is pretty much what a majority of students thought would happen. But then in the dark, we actually saw the exact opposite happen. The oxygen levels decreased and the carbon dioxide levels increased, which is absolutely not what a majority of people thought. And in fact, quite different from what we've always been told, that oxygen is given off by plants and carbon dioxide is taken in. So this is very confusing based on what, again, we've always been told. So the claim we can make then is in light conditions, plants give off oxygen gas and take in carbon dioxide. In dark conditions, plants take in oxygen gas and give off carbon dioxide. And as we go through understanding this data, we'll see if this is the only thing that's going on or if this is just the net, the overall increase and decrease. So it's possible, for example, that in the dark, plants are giving off oxygen, but they're just giving off so little that it looks like a decrease, or they're giving off the oxygen but then taking it right back in or something like that. We're not really sure. So let's kind of go through and see what's going on. All right, so a brief recap of photosynthesis that you learned in the last set of notes. So we have water, and that water is always absorbed from the roots. That's where plants get water. It comes in through their roots. And then light energy from the sun, which gets trapped by the chlorophyll. And then carbon dioxide, let's do this, go in through the stomata of the leaves. So all of this is going into the plant. And then what comes out of the plant is oxygen, which is given off into the air. That's the oxygen we breathe. And sugars in the form of glucose. Let's get the glucose in here, which can then be converted into other things. Now in this diagram it says converted into starch. I'm going to give you a more thorough explanation of this, which shows you that it's turned into lots of other things. And we know, we did the amylase lab, so we know that iodine turns dark blue in the presence of starch, and the crackers that we used were made of really just wheat. They were wheat and water. And so we saw lots of starch in those. So we do know that plants have a lot of starch. So a couple of things about this. What we're going to see is this carbon dioxide actually becomes this glucose. So we're not also giving off this carbon dioxide here. We've got to be producing carbon dioxide somewhere else, because we know from the photosynthesis equation, every 6 carbon dioxides make 1 glucose. It doesn't stay carbon dioxide. And so clearly there's another piece to the story, okay? So let's first look at biosynthesis. And I think that's a little easier to understand. So this is, what do plants do with the glucose? So we're going to first look at biosynthesis, and there's a couple pictures on here. We will explain. I will explain. So in the roots, glucose turns to starches. And so all of that glucose that's produced in the leaves, remember, glucose is only produced in the leaves. That's where the plant photosynthesizes. And then that glucose goes through the fibers of the plant all over the plant, just like the glucose that you digest goes all over your body into the different cells. So the glucose travels down from the leaves, down the stem, into the roots where it forms starches. Okay, starches are big glucose molecules. So just like glycogen for us, they're great storage of glucose for the plant. But this is also why root vegetables like your potatoes and your carrots and your beets are so starchy, because they're the roots of the plants. Glucose can also turn into cellulose. Now these both end in ose, and so we know that they're both carbohydrates. And so it's just a simple rearranging of the glucose molecules. Again, the glucose travels down from the leaves and ends up in the cells of the stem. And cellulose is what builds the cell wall. Now, all plant cells have a cell wall, but there's a lot of cellulose in the stems, which is what allows a plant to grow up on this. If you think mass-wise, there's a lot of mass. This is a sunflower up here in the flower compared to in the stalk, and yet it can hold itself up. That's because there's so much cellulose in the stems. And that those are going to be carbohydrates. So if you look at like what celery has, it doesn't have much of anything, but what it has is carbohydrate. So then this, because it's a sunflower, these are sunflower seeds, and we also saw this in the peanut seeds, right? Peanuts are the seeds of a plant. Glucose can turn into lipids. So if you remember, carbohydrates and lipids are made of the same three elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and so the glucose can chemically react in the cells of the seeds to turn into lipids. And so that's where you get your lipids from in your plant. You can also get proteins, and this could happen anywhere in the plant. There's not a certain place where it concentrates, although you do end up with a lot of proteins in the seeds as well. That's why like peanut butter is such a great source of protein. So in order to get proteins, though, you also need to add some nitrogen. And that nitrogen comes up from the roots. So this is where the nitrogen comes from. And this is also where, for example, if there is phosphorus in your proteins, that's where the phosphorus comes from. And in fact, sulfur, there's often sulfur in proteins. So that's where the sulfur comes from. That all comes up from the roots. But I want to focus on the nitrogen specifically because I don't know what's wrong with my mouse today. All proteins have nitrogen, whereas only some amino acids have phosphorus and sulfur. So all amino acids have nitrogen. Some amino acids have sulfur, some have phosphorus, some don't have either. So let's focus on the nitrogen. None of the nitrogen comes from our air. We know that air is 80% nitrogen, but that nitrogen is a triple bond. So like here in the air, it'd be nitrogen triple bonded to another nitrogen. And that's just too strong a bond for the cells of a plant to break apart. Now, we're going to see how that nitrogen does fit into something called the nitrogen cycle later in our decomposers unit. But the nitrogen that goes directly into the plant comes from nitrogen in the soil, specifically in the form of nitrates. But again, we'll worry about that later. So if the plant makes a fruit, sunflowers don't make fruits, so I went with this nice strawberry plant here as well. If the plant makes a fruit, then the glucose goes to the fruit and can turn into other sugars like fructose or sucrose, which are both much sweeter than glucose, which is why fruit tastes so sweet. And it's, of course, supposed to taste sweet because the plant makes the fruit to encourage animals to eat the fruit because fruit has seeds in it, and then the animals wander off and waste out the seeds someplace later, and it helps the plant to spread around. Seeds have a really tough seed coat on them that's hard to digest and break down. Some of you have the lovely experience of eating corn on the cob and going to the bathroom sometime later and noticing that there are still corn kernels in your waste product. That's because those kernels, those are the seeds of the corn, they have a really tough seed coat on them, and it's just too tough for you to break down. Remember, we talked about cows, for example, can break down substances in plants that humans can't because cows have 4 stomachs. They're called ruminants. So that's a lot of the biosynthesis in plants. But just like in animals, where our glucose goes to biosynthesis and to cellular respiration, remember, this should look familiar to you guys. This is a mitochondria. Plants also use glucose to make ATP. So plants need energy as well, and we know that plants have mitochondria. We know this from doing are organelle projects. And so plants must also use glucose for ATP in the same way we use glucose for ATP. That's cellular respiration. Plants undergo cellular respiration, which explains why they let off some carbon dioxide. Just like we let off carbon dioxide as we go through cellular respiration, so too do plants. So let's connect these two ideas. And this was the best diagram I could find. It's not exactly what I wanted, but it's close enough. And so I'll add in some certain things. So let's start with the water. So the water comes in, so this is the chloroplast, hopefully you recognize that, and this is the mitochondria. Chloroplast being the site of photosynthesis, mitochondria being the site of cellular respiration. So the water comes in, and this of course comes in from the roots. So let's add roots here. And then sunlight also comes in, right? Here's the sunlight, and obviously that comes in from the sun. And through all of the different reactions, the light and dark reactions, or the light dependent and light independent reactions, whatever you want to call them, you get oxygen out and glucose out, okay? Now this is where I want to add on to this. So a lot of this oxygen, in fact, goes out into the air. That's the O2 that we breathe. That's where we talk about, you know, our early atmosphere had no oxygen, and it was photosynthetic algae that created all of the oxygen in our atmosphere. And so most of that oxygen actually goes out into the air. But some of it goes to the mitochondria to undergo cellular respiration. Some of that glucose, too, goes out to the rest of the plant for biosynthesis. And let's see, I'm going to try to write bio. That's all I got for you. So there's bio, right? So that's going to biosynthesis, but some of the glucose is also going to the mitochondria for cellular respiration. And you get your heat, and you get your ATP, which is, you know, how you get your energy. It's actually, I don't know if this is going to work, but ATP to ADP is how you get the energy, right? So exact same process that happens in animal cells is happening in plant cells. And then that carbon dioxide that's let off, some of it does in fact go out into the air. Some of it goes back to the chloroplast, but some actually comes in from the air. And so what you've got is you do have some CO2 going out into the air. But remember, some of that product of photosynthesis is used for biosynthesis and stays in the plant. Some of it is used for cellular respiration and does end up going back out. So this whole idea of trees, you know, plant a tree to reduce your carbon footprint or to take carbon out of the atmosphere is not a myth. Plants over their lifetime generally take in about twice as much carbon dioxide as they give off. So they are what we would call a carbon dioxide sink, meaning you can sink carbon dioxide into plants and kind of hold it there. Now, when we get to decomposers, we're going to talk about what happens after the plant dies. But especially something like a tree has such a long lifespan and takes even longer to be completely decomposed that it's a sink for hundreds and hundreds of years. All right, so this integrates some new concepts with some stuff we already knew, which sometimes is really hard because we think we know the whole story and then we realize we don't. So take your time with this, and please make sure you're asking questions either online or in class. Have a good day.